Greetings everyone, Prashanta here from Divya Henna, and today we're going to talk about mixing your own henna paste. Mixing your own henna paste is something that I recommend every henna artist learn how to do at some point. You don't necessarily have to learn how to do it immediately when you're first starting out because it can be a little intimidating. There's a lot to learn between practicing every day and learning different design elements and learning different techniques and learning cone rolling and on top of that trying to figure out the right recipe for your own henna paste. It can be a little bit overwhelming. So I recommend initially look into some high quality henna supply companies. A lot of them will sell pre-rolled, pre-filled henna cones that you can store in your freezer for practice. And that's definitely also a good way to start out so you can learn what preferences you have about consistency. Everybody has their own personal preferences, so it's good to experiment with a bunch of different types. Try out a few different kind of henna cones, henna pastes from different companies, and see which one appeals to you. And then you'll get an idea for what you're aiming for with regard to consistency when you start mixing your own paste. So we'll start by talking about different types of henna powder. There are different henna powders available from different regions of the world. The one that a lot of henna artists tend to gravitate towards, it's my personal preference, is Rajasthani henna. It tends to give a more stringy quality paste that is good for draping lines. Some people even call it a snotty consistency. It can be a little sticky at times, and especially depending on the amount of sugar that you add to your paste. And then another type of henna powder that's very popular is Jamila, which comes from Pakistan. And that tends to have a little bit more of a creamy consistency. So a lot of henna artists will combine the two in ratios that are preferential to them, depending on the qualities that they need and the type of art they're doing with henna. So here's an example just to show you the difference in how the henna powder can look. Rajasthani henna powder, which we see over here, tends to be a little bit more of a bright green color. And then the Jamila tends to also be green, but have a slightly more brownish tinge to it. And again, I mentioned the Rajasthani tends to be a more stringy, sticky quality paste, and the Jamila tends to be a little bit more of a kind of creamy, thicker paste. So a lot of people will combine the two of them to get their optimal consistency in flow of the paste. One other thing I wanted to mention about the Jamila henna powder, it comes in this box with this beautiful woman on it, and there are counterfeiters that try to pretend that they're Jamila, and they'll use a similar packaging. But one way you can tell if it's the legitimate product is it tends to have this almost like holographic look on the bottom. And another thing you want to look out for is because they make henna that you can use in your hair that's not as finely sifted, and then they also make a higher sift that is easier to use for body art, and they call that body art quality henna. So you want to look on the bottom of the package for the J Jamila BAQ, and the BAQ stands for body art quality. So that's something you want to look for when you're using Jamila henna. So I'm going to show you the method that I use to mix henna paste. Every artist has their own preferred recipe and method. So this is not necessarily the right way. This is just the way I do it. And I encourage you, as always, to experiment with a lot of different recipes and techniques so that you can find out what works best for you and your own individual preferences. I like consistency, so I tend to measure out my ingredients so that I have a pretty reliable recipe that I know what to expect from, especially when you're working, if you're just playing around, with friends, it's not such a big deal. But when you start working professionally, you want to know that you have reliable results that you can stand by and that you can tell your clients what to expect as well. So I like to use, as I mentioned, the Rajasthani henna powder. And there's a number of different henna supply companies. So you want to just try a few different ones and see which one you prefer. I tend to think that all the henna grown in the same region tends to have similar qualities. So you can play around and see if you like any particular brand better. But if you're getting Rajasthani henna from a particular crop, a particular year, most of the companies are going to have similar results in my experience. And so this, as I mentioned, the Rajasthani has like kind of a bright green color to it. And you have to be careful also when you're dealing with henna supply companies to make sure you have a reputable supplier, because some people are unscrupulous and they will add dye to powder that's not necessarily high quality to make it look like a bright green color even though it's not. So you really want to find out if the company you're working with or getting your henna from is a very high reputable company and stands by their products. And a lot of times they'll give you samples to try so that you can make sure that you're happy with the results before you make a large purchase. So I've pre-measured on this little scale that I use. I like to, again, keep the amounts consistent of my ingredients. I've pre-measured 100 grams of henna powder in this bowl. And I like to work with 100 grams. You can go with less, but I always work in 20-gram increments when I'm deciding how much powder to add, because that's going to help me figure out how much essential oil, how much sugar I want to add, and it'll just help guide me about how much of the other ingredients I'm going to be using. I actually think 100 grams is a good amount, even for a beginner, because you can freeze whatever henna you're not using for practice, and that way you always have something ready in your freezer. If you get a surprise client, if you get a surprise person that wants to let you practice, if you just don't feel like mixing a new batch of henna every other day, it's a good way to just have a little extra on hand at all times. Henna can last in the freezer for anywhere from 6 months to a year, I would say. After that, I wouldn't want to use it in any professional setting, but it's good to just always keep a little bit of frozen henna on hand, and then that way you'll be able to use it whenever you need it. So we've talked about our henna powder, and now we're going to talk about the other ingredients that I add. I add high monoterpene essential oils. I prefer eucalyptus. There's a lot of different monoterpene essential oils that are available for henna artists to experiment with. Some artists like to use cajeput or tea tree oil or lavender or a combination of all of those. Some don't even use essential oil at all. Some of them use just water. I like the consistent results I get with eucalyptus. I don't have any personal issues with it. With cajeput, I tend to get reactions on my skin, so I avoid it. Tea tree gives me headaches. So these are just my personal preferences. And then I also use turbinado sugar. You can use a lot of different sticky agents in your henna to help make the paste stick to the skin. Some people don't use any sugar at all, and when I started out I didn't, but I found that the dried paste would just kind of flake off the skin really easily, and I had to be really careful about putting a sealant on top right away. When there's sugar in the paste, it tends to adhere better to the skin, and I've found that it tends to give a little bit better of a stain as well. So I like to put sugar, but that's one of the things you're really gonna have to experiment with, because, sorry about that, my dog's next to me shaking. But you really have to experiment with sugar, whether or not you want to add it and how much you're going to want to add, because that's very climate dependent. Sugar is a humectant. It sucks the moisture out of the air, and it can make your paste really runny and goopy if there's too much humidity. So if you live in a dry climate, you might want to add a little more sugar. If you live in a very humid climate, you might want to add a little bit less. And that's something you definitely have to play around with a little bit until you get your perfect formula. Just a quick comment about the proportions of the ingredients. I mentioned that I like to measure out my henna powder in 20-gram increments. The reason I do that is because for every 20 grams, I'm going to add 1 teaspoon of essential oil and 1 teaspoon of sugar. And that's just my starting point. I may end up adding a little more sugar later, but I always add 1 teaspoon of essential oil to every 20 grams. So that just helps me keep track of how much of that ingredient I'm going to be adding. I also add lemon juice to my paste. I only use organic lemon juice that doesn't have any preservatives or synthetic chemicals in it. I personally won't put anything into the paste that I'm going to use on my clients that I wouldn't want on my own skin. I'm really a stickler for very high quality products, and I think it gives you the best quality paste and the best results in the end. Since I have 100 grams here, I've measured out 5 teaspoons of the sugar, so I'm going to add that now. And I add all my dry ingredients first. Some people like to actually add the liquid first into the bowl and then add the powder to that. I honestly don't think it makes a huge difference either way. It's all going to mix together. Again, just a personal preference. So I've added my sugar. Now I'm going to add my essential oil, which I've pre-measured out so you don't have to waste time watching me. And then now I've measured out, what I like to do is mix half and half lemon juice and water initially. So I've measured out half a cup of liquid that consists of 1/4 cup lemon juice and 1/4 cup water. And I like to start off with a very thick mix. And once I mix it to a very thick consistency, I'll actually set that aside and wait for our dye release, which we'll talk about. And then the next day after the dye release, I'll add a little extra liquid to it. And when I store it in the freezer, any unused portion, I'll store it thick. And then I'll mix it when I'm ready to use it. And I like to do that because, as I mentioned before, the paste is climate sensitive. So depending on what kind of weather you're having, you might not want as much liquid, as much water and lemon juice in your paste. You might want it to be a little thicker, because if the sugar starts drawing the moisture out of the air, it could end up being a very goopy, sticky, runny paste. And that's going to be hard to work with. It's going to be frustrating for you, and you're not going to get the optimal results for your client. I haven't experimented a whole lot with just water recipe because I found that this recipe works for me and gives me consistent results. And also it has a slower demise, meaning the paste will retain its staining qualities for a longer period of time with the lemon juice. And when you have long appointments, that could be 10, 12 hours, depending on what your event is and what's going on, you want to have paste that's going to last throughout the event. So I tend to like to have that little extra added peace of mind that comes with using lemon juice. But if you encounter a client that has a citrus allergy, you certainly could make just a water mix. So now I've mixed my henna paste to a nice thick doughy consistency, and this is where I leave it to set it for dye release. I can always thin it down later after the dye release to whatever consistency I prefer. But for the dye release step, I just like to leave it this very thick doughy consistency, just a little ball at the bottom of the bowl. Some people have these fancy tricks that they like to do to test for dye release. They'll put a piece of plastic and then maybe put some paper towel or napkin on top and then let it sit. And then when the orange color starts coming up through the plastic and staining the paper towel, they'll know that it's ready. I think the dye release is obvious. You'll see a color change on the top layer, and I'll demonstrate that to you after I've set this aside. So I just put a piece of plastic on the top, and then I like to set it someplace warm. Some people put it on top of their refrigerator. I put it in my oven. Even though I live in a warm climate, I put it in the oven with the oven light on, and I just find that that gives a nice consistent warm temperature that's not too hot. If it's too hot, you can actually end up cooking your henna, so you don't want to do that. So to prepare my henna for the dye release, I put a piece of plastic over the top of the bowl. I secure it with a little rubber band. You don't have to do that if you don't want to. You don't have to have the plastic touching the henna. I never do. I just put it into the oven with the oven light on. I put it, because there's lemon juice in here, I put it for 24 hours for dye release, but it probably is ready a little sooner than that. I just like to be extra safe and secure about getting a good stain, so I like to let it go through the full dye release process. If you're using only a water mix, it can be ready in as little as a few hours. So you have to experiment with that as well to find out how your henna behaves and when the dye release happens based upon what ingredients you're putting into your recipe. So now, through the magic of television or YouTube, as the case may be, 24 hours have elapsed and we are ready to check to see if we have achieved dye release with our henna. So the henna, as you can see, the surface of it is a little bit darker than it was when I first put it overnight into my oven with the oven light on. And then I'm going to scrape the surface with a spatula so you can see if there's a difference in the color on the surface and what's underneath. And yes, there is. So you can see the outer surface is a darker brown color, and then underneath we have this kind of green color that we had when we first mixed it. So to me, that's a positive sign that the dye release has occurred, because there's a change and some of the lost zone molecules are expressing their dye. And here we can see underneath the green color of the fresh paste, and that means that we've achieved the dye release. So because I've mixed the paste so thick, which is what I usually do when preparing henna, I leave it really thick. At this point, I would add some more liquid, a little more lemon juice and a little more water, and then I would start mixing it with either by hand, or sometimes I use an old-fashioned egg beater, or sometimes I'll use a KitchenAid. It depends on what level of mixing I'm doing and what amount of paste I have. If it's a really big job, I'll use like a KitchenAid blender, but if I'm using just a smaller amount, I'll go with a little, I'll either do it by hand or I'll go with a little egg beater. So what I like to do is kind of roughly estimate what amount I want for whatever my purpose is, and then I'll kind of section that off, and then I'll take that amount and I'll mix that up, and then the rest I'll leave it thick and I'll put that in the freezer. So that way, when I take it out of the freezer to use it fresh, I can add water and or sugar at the time based on what conditions I'm dealing with in the environment. If it's a humid day, I might not want to add any more sugar. Also, it goes through some changes in the freezer. Something happens to the molecules when there's a crystallization of the moisture and then a defrosting. I actually prefer the texture of the henna after it's been frozen. So I like to put my henna in the freezer and defrost it and then use it. I think just it seems a little smoother. And at that point, you can still choose to add a little bit of water and a little bit of sugar if you choose at that point. So in this instance, I've elected to thin out the entire batch of henna at once. And you can see I've mixed it to a smooth consistency that I would liken to brownie batter. It's thin, it has a bit of stickiness to it. If I make a peak with it, it pretty much stays intact. And if I take a scoop of it and let it drop in about 2 seconds, I would say, it falls down to the rest of the batch. So this is the preferred consistency that I usually mix it to. But again, this is a very highly personalized thing. It depends on what type of work you like to do. Depends on how you hold your cone, what kind of cone material you're using. It's a very, very personalized preference. So this is something you'll need to play around with. And again, as I mentioned, it will also vary on the climate that you're in. So how much sugar you add. I didn't add any additional sugar because we're having a little bit of damp weather here. and I'm going to be using this paste tomorrow, so I'm anticipating it's going to be still a little bit damp tomorrow, and I don't want my paste to get too sticky or runny, so I didn't add any additional sugar. There are times when the weather's really dry that at this stage of mixing I'll add a little extra sugar. And as I mentioned, I'm also going to probably put this in the freezer for a little bit because I like what happens to the consistency after it freezes and defrosts. This is also the stage where I do a little quality assurance test by putting a little dab on the palm of one of my hands and leaving it for 5 to 10 minutes and then scraping it off just to make sure that I get a really nice stain, and I'll demonstrate that now. So here you can see I've drawn a little test heart. Some people just put a big blob on their hands. I like to make a little heart, and we'll check back in about 5-10 minutes and see how that stain progressed. So about 10 minutes have elapsed. Let's go ahead and scrape this off and see what's going on underneath. So as you can see, there's a nice bright orange pumpkin-y color stain after just 10 minutes of having the paste on my hand. So that means we can expect some nice, reliably good dark stain results from this batch of paste, and I feel confident to use this now for my clients. So there you have it, nice, freshly prepared, smooth, high quality henna paste that gives nice, reliable stain results. And I encourage you to try this at home. Happy hennaing!